10 words. We've been in this series for a plenty long time now. We're going to finish it off this morning. The 10 words are really more commonly known as the 10 Commandments, although God's Word regularly refers back to them as the words or the 10 words. A couple weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we read a secondary passage and it used the word commandments, and then some people were like, whoa, you told us it didn't say that. It's just the translation. It's using the common English that we would know. It's still 10 words is what it's actually referred to, just in case that threw you for a loop. But these 10 words, the 10 Commandments, God appears at the base of Mount Sinai to the people. He's in this cloud and fire, and he speaks to all of them at one time. Instead of just the voice of the prophet or just through Moses, he's speaking directly to God's people. This has happened just after 400 years of being in slavery. God takes them out of Egypt with Moses' help and leads them there on their way to the promised land. These 10 words they're not rules, they're not principles, they're not old-fashioned, outdated guidelines that don't apply to us anymore. They're actually a covenant agreement between God's people and Yahweh God himself. God saves them from Egypt, and that's the first 19 chapters of Exodus, and now he's turning them into his people. He's creating guidelines for them and saying, like, this is how you're going to be faithful with me, to me. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, right? He starts with that and he says, I loved you so much. I did this thing for you. Now I want you to be faithful to me. And here's how you're going to do it. And he gives them these 10 words to kind of create a new nation, a new society. And as we've looked at these, we've gone backwards. We've done a countdown list. We started with number 10 and came back, and today's number 1 because I think it's the most important. But we started with covet, and that was wanting something that was never supposed to be yours, desiring something that's not supposed to be yours. And lying was about slander, falsehood against others. Stealing isn't just taking something that's not yours, but it's also withholding something that you could be releasing to someone who has a need. We looked at adultery and marriage and what God's plan was it before the fall in Genesis 3, before sin entered the world. We looked at murder and how human beings are image bearers created in the image of God. And Jesus takes it one step further and says it's not just about killing, but even when you have evil thoughts about someone, hateful thoughts, honor your father and mother. We said it's not just about children listening, but honoring those that have gone before us, those that are older than us, those that have more life experience than us. Because why? They are image bearers. The Sabbath was a day of rest, a day set aside to do nothing, stopping. Using your name is not just about swearing, but as followers, we are taking God's name upon ourselves. We are the priests and priestesses right here. We are God's representative in this world, and we should represent him well. And then last week, form. We can't create an image of who God is because none have seen God. Nothing can be put in God's place. He's above all and beyond all, and while he wants to have a personal relationship with you, he is still the creator of the universe beyond our comprehension. Something I didn't say last week, and I'm just going to poke it in here, even though it's not in my notes. You know all those images that you classically refer to as Jesus, the flowy, gorgeous hair, the Caucasian Jesus, that's not what he looked like. That's not real. It's not real. Okay, so here we are, we're at number 1. And if we get number 1 right, it's why we've gone backwards. If you get number 1 right, everything else will begin to easily fall in line. So in verse 3 of Exodus chapter 20, you shall have no other gods before me, which seems pretty straightforward, right? It's just a simple line, seems really, really simple. And just like everything else, I think there's a little more depth than just that. We are, as a people, most of the world thinks of whatever God you're serving, we think monotheistically, meaning one God, right? We understand this to be true, but even atheists, if you ask an atheist, do you believe in God? They would say, I don't believe in God, singular. They don't say, I don't believe in gods, right? Because even in not believing in God, they still believe that there would be one. If they didn't believe in one, they wouldn't believe in that one. Does that make sense? Like, it's not that they're thinking of multiple gods, because that's just not in our context, right? Which, oddly enough, the actual word atheist itself is about God himself. Like, I am without a God, but it's still singular, a theist. But God here is talking to Israel. They have left Egypt, and Egypt had many gods. Most reports, when they try to figure out all of the Egyptian gods, there were around 1,400 Egyptian gods that they would worship and serve in their temples and in their homes. I don't even know how you keep track of that many. Like, that would be confusing to me. So on some level, God's telling his people, hey, all the other nations around you, they have multiple gods, but I'm the only one. At the beginning of this series, the first few that we looked at, we particularly looked back into Genesis, and we kind of like, we went through and how God's trying to correct the creation story. And we're going to go back to Genesis, but not to the creation story. In Genesis chapter 35, God is calling Jacob to leave where he's at, and he's going to go to Bethel. But before Jacob goes, he says to his people, to his family, to his servants, to the people, to his tribe that he's leaving, he says, all the gods that you're worshiping, they've got to go. Let's look at it. Genesis 35, starting with verse 2. So Jacob said to his household, and all those that were with him, get rid of the foreign gods that you have with you, and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let's go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave Jacob all their foreign gods they had, and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak of Shechem. They have a funeral service for all the extra gods, because God is calling them back to him as the one and only God. We would love to say that that's where the struggle ended, but that was not where the struggle ended. God gives these 10 words to the Egyptians. He gives them, Moses is still alive. Moses is still their leader. But when you go just past this, Moses dies in Deuteronomy, and who becomes the leader? Anyone? Joshua? It's a J word. You were on it. Joshua becomes the leader, and the people that Joshua is leading into the promised land, these are the second generation, right? All of their parents were in Egypt. They all died in the desert, but they know where they came from, right? Like most of us, if you grew up with your parents, you know where your parents came from. You have heard stories about where they grew up and their family and whatever. They know that one generation, their parents were slaves in Egypt. But in Joshua 24, Joshua is speaking to the people. Joshua 24, starting with verse 2. Joshua says to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods." And then in the next couple verses, it talks about how Abraham believed and followed the one true God, and how Isaac did it, and how then Joseph leads them to Egypt. And then in picking up in verse 5, he says, "Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. And when I brought your people out of Egypt, you came out to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and he brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the wilderness for a long time." So God through Jacob is saying, do you remember what it is that I've done? Are you so far removed from remembering what I've already done for you? Have you already forgotten? And then further down in 14, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day who you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served before the Euphrates and the gods of the Amorites in the land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua is calling his people, God's people, he's telling them two things. One, Yahweh is the only one true God, but he's also saying you need to ditch all of the other gods that you're serving. And here's where we here in 2022 mess this up. We look at this and we're like, no problem, I've never served any other gods. Like, I have this down. The problem isn't, so in this time when Joshua's talking to them, it's not that the people forgot about who Yahweh God was. They believed that Yahweh God was God. It was that they would tack on other gods. So if they're living in the land of the Amorites, they just said that living in the land of the Amorites, they would look around and they would say, well, these people have this, whatever, God of the land, God of the soil, that seems like it's doing good things. They worship it, they have these good crops, so I'm just going to tack on that God of the soil to Yahweh God. It's not like they didn't know Yahweh existed, I'm going to just tack this one on. It's like when you get a wedding invitation and it says Pastor Aaron +1, right? Like, this is like the +1 God. I'm just going to tack it on. I already know that Yahweh exists. I need an extra one just in case. We're holding on in case things don't work out. If Yahweh doesn't give me what I want, maybe this other God will. And then God's people have a chance to respond in verse 16. Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake God to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God." Remember who God is, what he has done for you. God, at the very beginning of this passage, this was week 1. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then throughout the rest of the Old Testament, he keeps saying it over and over and over and over again. Why? Because we're forgetful people. He reminds his people how much he loves them. Hey, do you remember me? I'm the God who loves you. Do you remember what I've done for you? We are a forgetful people. Remember. We have forgotten what God has done for us. Even the disciples, there's all these great times where here's these guys walking with God himself here on earth, and they're just like forgetful of what he's done. They only spend 3 years with him, but it's as if they're like, 95 years old and they're forgetting a detail from their 20s, right? But it happened just a couple weeks ago. There's a story where Jesus says, he's talking about the yeast of the Pharisees because the disciples have forgotten to bring bread with them. And they're like, oh, I bet he's talking about we forgot bread. Wonder where we're going to get bread. And Jesus goes, do you not remember? I fed 5,000 people. You just had a little bit. Do you not remember what I've already done? How could you have forgotten that already? We are forgetful people. We screw things up. We continue, and yet he continues to welcome us back to him. We have these stories, all of us, of our journey toward Christ, things that God has done for us in our lives. Some of them are dramatic things that we have encountered along the way. Remember what God has done for us, but also realize that he is the only God. This seems very logical to us. We understand, our theology says that there is only one God. We understand that, but in our practical living, we are what's called polytheists. We really serve multiple gods. Even though we recognize there's one God, much like Israel, we know that God exists, but we have some +1 gods just on the side in case God doesn't take care of us the way that we would like him to. We go to other places or other ideas to get what we want. Let me just give you a few real quick. Money is the easiest one. We don't like to say that we worship money, but we worship money. Popularity, we respond, who's responding to that thing that I wrote, that post that I posted? How did they respond to that? How am I being perceived? What is my image that I'm putting out there for everyone to love and click that little button to make me feel good? We worship the perfect family. The perfect family can become our little side god. We want to make sure that everyone perceives us as like having it all together. Political success can be our side god. We want our party to be in control, and so we put our time and our energy into that. Food can become our god. Things aren't going the way we want it to go, and so we turn to our comfort space of whatever it is, pancakes, right? Information can be our god. We sit in front of the TV and we digest, and we need more information, and we sit in front of our computer or on our phone and we need more information, and we have to gather and we have to collect, and we spend our time and our energy. I'm going to go one step further. It's very possible that a church can be a side god, because we need things to be in order, and we need things to be the way they are, and we need to be comfortable. And if they're not going just the right way, then maybe it's not successful, and maybe we're not doing what we need to. All those years of youth ministry, there's a writer, Mike Yaconelli. He's in youth ministry world, he's referred to as like the godfather of youth ministry. He started doing like serious, what we know as the model of youth ministry now, like he started doing that in the early 70s, and he was this crazy guy. He started this major corporation, Youth Specialties, to just pour into youth workers. But in one of the books that he wrote, he said this to youth workers. He said, if there's not a rule in your church specifically created because of your youth ministry, you're not doing youth ministry the right way. And the example he would always use is like, no Kool-Aid can be in the parlor, right? Like, because at some point, Kool-Aid was in the parlor and it spilled on the carpet, and somebody got really, really mad about that because we can't have Kool-Aid on the carpet. Heaven forbid that teenagers are using our churches, but we can't have Kool-Aid in the parlor, right? It's possible that your church can be a little side god to who God actually is. And if you're hearing these things and you're saying, Pastor Aaron, you're crazy, that's just not the way it is, I want to be real honest with you. It's possible that it's your side god that's pushing back because you're uncomfortable with that. We love the tag-along, the +1 gods. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is speaking. Pastors love this passage. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one or love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And pastors love this because we throw this out there and we say like, hey, that just means you need to give us the money. Give it to the church, right? But I think Jesus is saying something so much bigger than that. He's saying you can't have two gods. You can't have God, Yahweh God, and then a side god. And he's just using money as the example here. You can't have a backup. There's no good +1. There's a book on these 10 words by an author named Jen Wilkins. 10 Words to Live By is the name of the book if you want to look it up later. But in the first chapter, which is on God itself, I want to read you this quote because it's everything that I'm saying. It often takes a crisis to point out our folly. There's nothing like a good financial crisis to teach us our worship of money and comfort in addition to God. There's nothing like a wayward child or a divorce to teach us our worship of having a perfect family in addition to God. There's nothing like the aging process to teach us of our worship of health and beauty in addition to God. Do you realize that there's only one God? Do you really? I mean, is it more than head knowledge? I mean, we would all sit here if I took a poll as you were coming in and I said, like, do you believe there's only one God? Like, I would guess we'd probably be around 100%, right? Sure. But do we really have some side gods that, like, are running the show? Because what happens is this. When you know that God, Yahweh God exists and you have a side god, slowly you start dumping some more energy into the side God than you do Yahweh God. And pretty soon, the side God becomes the God that we're serving. But the thing of it is, when the rubber hits the road, when bad things happen, when there's bumps that the waves are crashing over your boat, it's in those moments that those gods don't hold up, and we go, oh, right, I'm reminded that there's only one God. We need to respond then to God's calling on our life, the one true God. Jesus is taken to the desert. He is without food for 40 days, and the devil shows up. And again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. And Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. That's what our plus one gods tell us. They say, like, we can hold up. You just give me a little bit more control. I can look at all the things that I can give you. I'll give you anything that you want. But our response is crucial. No. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Let's jump back to Joshua, to that story. Joshua tells his people, like, hey, you have to ditch all these extra gods. I'm telling you now that my family, like, we're only going to serve God. What is it you're going to do? And so at the end of that chapter in 22, then Joshua says, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, says Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey. This last word, or the first word, because we've gone out of order, it's really hard. It's really hard. Mentally, we all say, yes, there's only one God. But to live that out, to be truly monotheistic and not polytheistic, to not have these plus one gods, there's all these things that are pulling us in other directions. Remember what God has done. Realize and recognize that other gods are in our lives. Confess that. Repent of that. Do away with that. You remember at the very beginning, like, let's have a funeral for those gods. Let's bury them under a tree. Let's say we're done with that. There is only one God. He is calling us back to him to do away with all of the plus ones. There can only be one God, Yahweh God.